Alright, time for another draftphysics.com video presentation. Debate physics also, but again, we can't have the debate because nobody will do the actual, okay, here's my argument, counter it with something besides slander and nonsense. And they can't do the besides slander and nonsense thing, so we're just stuck with me presenting the rational argument to their irrational mush. And so, yes, the subject will be the two slit, a continuation, so you probably should watch the first video. But because I'm a nice guy, or I'm trying to be anyway, I'll give you the little brief synopsis of what can be understood about this here slit stuff. So the simple argument is there's two versions of the single. That is the single impediment or the single opening. And what can be observed is that there's a clear relationship between the surfaces and the outcome. That the distance between the surfaces decides mostly what's going to happen here. Now obviously the frequency of the light does matter, but it only matters incidentally because it's the surfaces, the distance between the surfaces that are really the sources. They're the things creating the energy, and the energy goes to locations and it's either in phase or out of phase, or in phase or out of phase. So it's just basically scatter off the surfaces. It's really easy to observe, frankly. So the pattern always had distinctive features that physics just ignored, like this double maxima. Water waves don't do this. So it's an important feature they totally ignore. Now the double slit makes everything really clear, because what you're really bringing together is not two single slits. You're bringing together two surfaces that are far away and two surfaces that are close together. And it comes out in the math perfectly. So if you really understand the math, you understand there's lots of wavelengths between these two widest distances. That makes the little nodes, and it tells you exactly how many there'll be. The number of wavelengths that fit in this total distance will decide how many of these little nodes there are going left, and then how many going right. You just double the number. And these big humpy things are created by the small distance. The small distance is creating the secondary pattern, the envelope pattern as it's called. And it's just scatter off the surfaces. The photons go in, the ones that rub against the surface get broken, the pieces fly off, and there's a 50-50 chance when they hit a surface they're going to be in phase or out of phase. 50-50 chance. So it's just scatter. So all the fringe light, all the light that goes to these other locations is all light that went next to the surfaces, and that comes out in the reality because the centers are very bright and it gets dimmer as it goes further away. Indicating that this is not a wave pattern. Wave patterns would be just as strong here as they would be here, as here, as here, as here. There wouldn't be any difference. So clearly not a wave. Lots of evidence for that. So the basic theory is photons are more like this. Okay, they're little discrete bits of quanta. And this whole thing is a photon. It hits a surface and it basically pushes an electron. The electron pushes other atoms and pushes their electrons, which means that the second impact creates more energy into the electron, and then the third impact creates more energy, and that's basically the polarization, is the fact that these impacts happen sequentially in a direction. So the same location could create more than one photon in a direction based on the fact that you're giving electrons velocity. And it's really just a tipping point argument. You're just saying, if I'm going to give it extra energy, I have to hit it while it's moving in the direction that I want to add energy. If it's moving the other direction, I can't add energy to the electron. So it's really basic, really simple, easy to understand, very mechanical. No woo involved, no entanglement, no superposition, no interference. No energy interferes with energy anywhere. There's nothing hitting anything, doing any of that crap. The photon energy is just being a pattern in the field of energy. The pattern is being disturbed, and then the surface is interpreting the pattern. And that's all there is. Not complicated, not mushy, not wooey, not what they say. So they have it all wrong. And they won't allow you to make this argument. They won't allow you to discuss it on a talk page. So you can't go to Wikipedia and even suggest that they have made a mistake, that they're quoting the wrong books, that what they're saying in their text is absolute nonsense that doesn't have anything to do with the truth. And so you can see they have the two patterns here in this image. And I guess I could blow that up so you can see it better. You know, single slit, and you know, you can't see the fringes, but they're there. And the double slit. The single slit can actually have 50, 60, 70 little nodes to it. So they're using very, very narrow slits. If you open the slit up a little bit, you get lots of pattern. And the double slit has obviously two patterns. It has the single slit envelope pattern, that is the narrow, the short distance between 2 point sources is creating the big blobs, and the light from the furthest distance, the two sources that are far away, is making lots of little dots, lots of different locations. So a wide opening gives you lots of triangles that you can make where the hypotenuse is a full wavelength of light longer than the other side to the triangle. All right, so very simple. Now while I have this blown up, I might as well get to this image down here. So this is Young's drawing, and it's clearly of water waves. There's no double maxima here. So again, it doesn't match. Light doesn't do what water does. There's a clear difference in the pattern. And yet they pretend, well, close enough. We're going to call it something it isn't. Okay, and again, this is the simplest pattern in the universe, on, off, on, off. And they're just saying that all on-off patterns have to be created by something called mechanical wave interference, when no, there's lots of ways you can duplicate an on-off pattern. All right, so I guess we should read. I think we already did that. So we'll continue where we left off in the previous video. Okay, if one illuminates two parallel slits, the light from the two slits again interferes. So they're just saying we have to believe in some concept that the photons are in the space and they're crashing into each other, which photons never do, and that somehow they're canceling each other, which they can't do. You know, it's just made up. It's not a good theory. It's really a lousy theory. It essentially violates the thermodynamic and Newtonian laws of conservation of energy. Here the interference is a more pronounced pattern. It's not more pronounced, it's more detailed. So that's more bad rhetoric. It has more details in the pattern. Okay, with a series of alternating light and dark bands. So again, it's not just a series of light and dark bands. It's clearly an interrupted series of light and dark bands. So, they can't say any of it actually accurately. The width of the bands is a property of the frequency, when clearly the width of the bands is clearly a more dominant property of the distance between the surfaces. The distance will change the size a lot more than the frequency. You could change the frequency with quite a bit, and you'll still have dots that might only be twice as large. I change the distance, I dramatically can change the size of the bars. So it's clearly being controlled by the distance between the surfaces, and obviously that distance combined with the wavelength of the light will decide how many wavelengths can fit inside the distance. But the change in the wavelength will not make as big a difference as a change in the distance between the surfaces. So it, again, is where physics has chosen badly. They think distance controls energy when it's time that controls energy, and it's clearly, in this case, distance that's controlling the size of the bands, and the frequency is a minor contributor. Frequency of illuminating light. See the bottom photograph to the right. So they're saying that this terrible drawing, okay, is of Young's is somehow a real illustration of what photons do. So no photon experiment does this. The outcome is not this. And if you put round waves on these openings, okay, then you'll have your point sources in the wrong location and your math won't get the right answer. So you can't put your point sources in the center of the slits where the center of the wave would be. So even that isn't right. It won't mathematically get a right answer. So in spite of the math being wrong, in spite of the drawings being wrong, in spite of the fact that the truth tells you that the two patterns, the single slit and the double slit, are completely different, in spite of all those facts, they just talk this superficial rubbish. All right. When Thomas Young first demonstrated this phenomenon, it indicated that light consists of waves. So it's not the first time the phenomenon was demonstrated. That should be noted, that Newton did do the single impediment. He did do a single hair. He did lots of things, and he did a single opening. Yes, it didn't occur to him to do a double slit, but he did the components of a double slit. He did the impediment and he did the opening. And he certainly did lots of aperture, changing the size of an aperture, lots of experiments. It indicates that light consists of waves. It doesn't indicate it. It's not nail in the coffin evidence. All of these exaggerations and distortions, none of it's true. If you just do a little superficial analysis, you can see all these inconsistencies. You can see where it doesn't match. And you can also, just looking at it, you could sit there and say, well, look, I look at the double slit pattern. What do I see? I see two patterns. And then you just look at the slits and you say, well, how can I make two patterns? Well, what do I have? There are two distinctly different things. The two distinctly different distances between surfaces. That's the obvious giveaway. And they couldn't have cared less. So they didn't do any real analysis. They just jumped to a superficial. They looked at a little fuzzy Sasquatch picture and then said, okay, there must be Sasquatches. It's just terrible science. As the distribution of brightness, it's a platypus kind of thing. It's just, they look at it and say it has a bill and webbed feet. There, it's a duck. It's just that superficial. Okay. As the distribution of brightness can be explained by the alternating additive and subtractive interference of the waveform. So right there you have a huge, big, fat, giant lie. Okay, because the distribution, as you can see in the pattern, it diminishes rapidly. Okay, the strength of the number of photons, the amplitude, the number of photons getting to the further locations is diminishing rapidly. And it would do exactly the opposite in a wave pattern. A wave pattern, it wouldn't get weaker and weaker and weaker. So again, more nonsense. Young's experiment performed in the early 1800s, 1801, played a critical role in the understanding of the wave theory of light. And exactly, so pretty much garbage superficial analysis was taken as real physics. So we're right back to 1735 and Deschardelet doing her little silly denting clay experiments, and the ignorant physicists fall for it. Okay, and that's all you can say. They don't do any real hard analysis. They don't do any further experiments. They just jump on the bandwagon and start playing the tune, and that's it. Okay, no real thinking. Okay, and then all the next generation of scientists all just want to talk about something else. They want to do some other fancy physics, so they don't bother seeing if it's true, the story they're being told. So they're told a story about the magical slit experiment, the magical photons, and the interference, and the da-da-da. And so they presume all of that crap is part of the reality they have to explain. And so it just, once a crappy foundation, you're going to have a crappy building. They built this on quicksand. All of these premises that they have in physics are wrong. It's not about waves, and it's not about ethers, and it's not about entanglements, and it's not about antiparticles, and it's not about dark matter. All of this stuff is crap. It's not about 400 different little kinds of energetic bits. It's about charge. It's about electrons. It's about force. It's not about bent geodesics. All right. Vanquishing the corpuscular theory of light proposed by Isaac Newton. So they say it was vanquished, all right, and it was only in their pop culture, so only in the minds of people who didn't really look at it, who just jumped to a superficial conclusion, and who basically wanted it to be true. They wanted the world to be this silly wavy world, this wooey world of wooey waves that somehow appealed to them, and so they jumped to this conclusion really easily because they wanted the physics to be fancy and fun, and they didn't want it to be mechanical and basically pointing out that we're just living as drones in a deterministic cold universe, which had been accepted model of light propagation in the 17th, 18th century. What was the only choice that actually did work. So that's the funny part, right? Kind of obviously, people drew rays of light coming off the sun because we see them. We see the clouds create those rays. We see it happen in the real world. It doesn't look like waves. It doesn't act like waves. All right, continuing. However, the later discovery of the photoelectric effect demonstrated that under different circumstances, okay, you're just talking about what do photons do. And in the slit experiment, you can kind of see that what are photons doing? Well, they're hitting a surface and they have a choice. They either get absorbed or they get reflected. And so you know the energy is hitting if you get a reflection. But is it possible that the energy is still hitting when you don't get a reflection? And that would be something for them to answer. What happens in the places where there's no photon? Is the energy still absorbed in those locations? Do those locations still get warm? These are questions they never even cared to ask and certainly didn't look for any answers. All right, demonstrated that under certain circumstances that light behaves as if it is composed of discrete particles. So we know that that's what the energy equations basically say, that it has to come in clumps, okay, that there's no half a photon. That don't happen. And that the increase in the photon is basically in discrete clumps. You have to add energy to electrons in clumps. You have to add electrons in clumps. The electrons are clumps. It's a clumpaverse. It's not some wave-averse. All right, and waves would indicate that it would be more like a, what's the word for the difference between digital and analog, right? It's not an analog universe. It's a digital universe. It comes in bits. Okay. These seemingly contradictory discoveries made it necessary to go beyond classical physics. No, it made it necessary to go beyond reason and rationality and decide to make your Reese's peanut butter cup. Okay, but this isn't like just mixing chocolate and peanut butter. This is serious, okay? You're mixing two opposing ideas like love and hate, murder and hug. It's not the same stuff. You're making a monster here, a Frankenstein. You're not going to be making something better. The compromise is a nonsense. There is no rational compromise between the two ideas. And you're just making a horrible mess with some silly notion that it's a wavicle or a however you would do that. Classical physics and take into account the quantum nature of light. So there's no quantum nature, so see what it says here for quantum. Fundamental theory in physics that describes the behavior of nature at and below the scale of the atoms. It's the foundation of all quantum physics. So yeah, the silly presumption that there's a bunch of stuff that doesn't know where it is and doesn't know where it's going. And it just poofs here or poofs there. It's the poof theory. So they ought to just be called quantum proof physics, which includes quantum chemistry, absolute bullshit, quantum field theory, which isn't really a theory at all. It's just an ether theory of sorts. Doesn't really take into account that the energy is in the force. The energy is in the pressure in the universe. The stuff moving the speed of light is essentially a high pressure atmosphere. And we're existing in that high pressure atmosphere. Okay, so bad. Feynman was fond of saying, so why should we care? Why is Feynman the god of frickin' physics? All right, I mean, and then Feynman's lecture on this subject is so bad. It's so ill-detailed. It's so poorly and superficially constructed. It's just full of nonsense that never even took place, experiments never done. I mean, it's a horrible display of science. Was fond of saying that all of quantum mechanics can be gleaned from carefully thinking through the implications of this single experiment. So by implications, he means all of the WUI implications. Because they got the answer wrong, because they chose badly in terms of determining what the phenomenon is being created by, either the surfaces disturbing photons or some sort of random god that decides that photons automatically get bent because they went through an opening, which is just absolute nonsense. So Feynman's answer is shut up and calculate and just say all the photons are bent, when clearly that's not what happens. All the photons aren't bent. That's why there's so much light that goes straight. That's why the centers are so bright. It's because a lot of the photons aren't bothered at all. He also proposed as a thought experiment that if detectors, so here at least, so before they lied and talked about the detector experiments actually being done. So this single page, the last video, right? It said clearly the detector experiments were real. And now here, they're going to say they weren't real. So it's just an overt deception. It's a contradiction. So they can't even get the story straight. And this is on a key subject in physics. This isn't like some obscure little subject. No, this is a key subject in physics, and they can't even describe the history accurately. So this is actually the correct statement. This is the statement that should be 5 paragraphs up. All right. He also proposed as a thought experiment. That's what it should say earlier when they talked about the detector bullshit, right? That if detectors were placed before each slit, the interference pattern would disappear. So that it was never done. There are no detectors of photons. None of this can be done. So it's all made out of him telling us what would happen in his imaginary perception of the reality. And he couldn't even get simple things right. Like he couldn't even understand that the slits are 1 millimeter apart. And that when they go to a distance, they're still going to be, the light photons are still going to be 1 millimeter apart. They're not going to create 2 bulges, one over here and one over here. They're going to create 2 patterns that are going to be almost perfectly on top of each other. So he couldn't even get that right. But right there, that's just an amazing that they would talk about detectors in the second or third paragraph, and then they say way down here, oh, never mind, because, yeah, that never really happened. All right. So here we have some other complex experiment, no doubt. The Englert-Greenberger duality relation. Oh, come on. What the fuck could that possibly be? Wave-particle duality relation, often loosely referred to as, oh, that's a loose reference, the Englert-Greenberger Yatsen duality relation, or who cares what it's called? Just get to what it is. Relates the visibility V of the interference frisons with the definitiveness or distinguishability D. I mean, what a pile of crap, right? Now, the relation is that it's nothing like water waves. That's the simple statement. Light doesn't do what water does. Fact. All right. Provides a detailed treatment of the mathematics of the double slit interference in the context of quantum mechanics. Well, I guess we're going to have to do that silly page, right? Because I'm sure the mathematics isn't going to explicitly say that all the math works perfect as long as you think of the slits as light bulbs. So if you think of the slits as light bulbs, and all you want to know is with the fringe patterns, the light bulb theory works perfectly. So just think of the surfaces, right? The surfaces of the slit as being light sources, and mechanically it all fits. All right. A low-intensity double slit experiment was first performed by E.I. Taylor in 1909. So this low-intensity stuff, now we're getting into the woo physics, okay, where they're going to say they can make single photons. All right, and they can't make single photons because to make single photons, what they do is they take a bright light and then they put smoked glass in the way. And what is smoked glass? It's dirty glass. It means it has a whole bunch of particles in it. Okay, and what are the particles? They're surfaces. That's what particles are, surfaces. So what are they doing to the photons? Oh, that's right, they're breaking the photons. They're making the photons go in all kinds of different directions, which means they're changing their phase. So they're constantly changing the phase of the photons and sending a bunch of pieces through the smoked glass. So the smoked glass isn't producing one photon or two photons. It's producing potentially millions. It's just that they're all in pieces. Okay. By reducing the level of incident light until photon emission absorption events were mostly non-overlapping. So that's a way of trying to say single photon at a time. And that only has to do with how many pieces you're putting together. So if you can imagine, in the slits experiment, you're only spreading them in one dimension. So they're all spreading in one direction because the electrons are moving in and out of the surface. So all you can do is bend the photon that way, or you can bend it that way. You're not bending it that way or that way or that way. The smoked glass, on the other hand, is bending them in all directions. So you're sending fringes in all directions. So obviously you have a lot of potential photons, but you're spreading them over a much larger surface. All right. A slit interference experiment was not performed with anything other than light until 1961. All right, so this is when we get into the silly electron experiments that aren't anything like. Electrons are charged. You cannot send a random electron anywhere. Electrons don't have a random direction, okay? They're charged. You have to move them through a charged field in a direction. They have an explicit direction. And then when you release an electron, it exists in a world where there's charge all around it. And it's going to move in the direction where there's the strongest positive charge. So whatever's the most positive in its environment, it's going to start moving in that direction. When Claus Johannes-Jonsson of the University of Tübingen performed it with coherent electron beams. So there's no such thing as whatever that means, coherent electron beams. These are still not photons that you don't know what slit they're going to go through. So they're still, this is basically saying you're aiming the electrons now. Okay, and multiple slits. So we know this is a garbage experiment, but we will look up the footnotes and see if there's any evidence of it anywhere on the internet. In 1974, the Italian physicist blah 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 and blah 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 and blah 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 performed the related experiment using single electrons. So again, the very idea of creating a single electron is more nonsense. From a coherent source and a biprism beam splitter. So it's nothing like the two slits. It's a beam splitter. So they're claiming that the two paths are the same photons, that somehow those are the same pieces, when it can be clearly understood that the very function of a beam splitter means you are changing the light. The light that's transmitted through is going to be different than the light that reflects. Okay, showing the statistical nature, the buildup of the interference pattern. So it's not the interference pattern, it's a pattern. And the pattern in electrons doesn't have a double maxima. It's missing a lot of features. So again, they don't care about what the specific pattern is actually doing. They just care that it's some sort of on-off pattern, and therefore it must be interference. So every on-off pattern in the universe, you go off and switch your light switch on and off. Somehow they're going to be saying, oh, you're the byproduct of an interference, as predicted by quantum theory. So again, this silly crap that they predicted anything, just more hype and nonsense. They don't predict anything explicit. They don't say anything explicit. It's all just hype. They haven't predicted anything. In 2002, the single electron version of the experiment was voted the most beautiful experiment by readers of Physics World. Well, that says a lot about Physics World, doesn't it? I mean, come on. Just too silly. Since that time, a number of related experiments have been published with a little controversy. Whatever with a little controversy means. That means they shut up anybody who said, it's really not the same experiment, you know. You really shouldn't call it. It's really not the same phenomenon at all, because you have a whole different kind of instrumentality that's causing the effect through a whole different mechanism. I mean, it really is too silly. Okay, in 2012, Stefano Fabella and co-workers sent single electrons into nano-fabricated slits. So I think this is the one where they did inside an electron microscope, and used a piece of gold with slits burned into it, little tiny ones. Okay, they had all kinds of problems as the photons went straight through the gold. All right, and by detecting the transmitted electrons with a single electron detector, they could show the buildup of the double slit pattern. So again, they're assuming that, you know, first off, just imagine the stupidity of this argument. Electrons are charged. You can't send them through a slit without the charge bending them. You can understand that, right? So you know, you're guaranteed that the electrons are going to be bent. The ones that go closest to the surface are going to be bent a lot. The ones that don't go close to the surface are going to be bent none at all. So, I mean, obviously you're creating all kinds of room for the very pattern we're talking about, in the sense that the more electrons are going to go to locations because you're basically scattering them at the surfaces again. They're charged, for fuck's sake. I mean, I guess I should make the argument, depending on what the charge of the material is, the electrons will either be forced in or they'll be forced out. So that's exactly how they focus electrons, for, again, is by applying a charge to pieces of metal that the electrons have to pass. I mean, that's exactly how they control the path of electrons. All right, since the time and number of related experiments has been published with a little controversy. Okay, so just bullshit. So we did this fabricated thing. Many related experiments involving the coherent interference have been performed. So this has nothing to do with interference. None of these objects actually bang into each other. There is no evidence that anything ever interferes. All you're doing is changing phase in a lot of cases. And in some cases, you're just bending things. They are the basis of modern electron diffraction, microscopy, and high-resolution imaging. So none of their theory is necessary to the creation of any of that technology. All you have to know is that photons are bent by surfaces. You don't have to know why. Okay. In 2018, a single particle interference was demonstrated for antimatter. I mean, you know, the very idea that they claim this stuff called antimatter exists is just such crap, okay? And that they have some sort of understandable even experiment is just amazing. So the very fact that they would include this nonsense in here. So yes, we'll go try to find this silly experiment, but I'm sure it's going to be nothing like a double slit experiment, all right? And there's no such thing as antimatter, so it just doesn't exist. Positrons are just electrons going fast. All right, anyway. So interference from individual particles. So this is, again, their claim that they can create this circumstance of individual particles. They can't. And look at what they're showing. I mean, they're showing a pattern, and then they're showing the creation of a pattern that really isn't duplicating it. You know, I mean, realistically, it's not the full pattern, right? We're not seeing the double slit here at all. We're just seeing 3 bars. And we're not seeing a double maxima. We're not seeing a lot of features that should exist if it was a true double slit. Okay, an important version of the experiment involves single particle detection. So there's no such thing as making single photons there's no such thing as a single photon gun. The only way they can make single photons, quote unquote, is to put obstructions in front of the photons. And clearly the obstructions are not absorbing all of the light. Lots of the light is getting through the obstructions. It's just broken. Sending coherent particles through a double slit apparatus one at a time. So there isn't one at a time photons going through the apparatus. There's a whole bunch of noise being sent to the slits, of all broken pieces. And just like the regular slit thing, it's basically just changing the phase of those bits. And you have some percentage of the crap you throw in will actually be in phase when it hits the target. And so that's all you're saying is that you're taking a bunch of noise and you're going to make some signal out of it. And the percentage of noise to signal depends on how much slits you have and how much noise you produced. So you're just reconstructing broken pieces, but because the broken pieces are moving in all kinds of directions, it's not as easy to put them. You don't have a 50-50 chance of recreating a photon because the pieces are going in all kinds of directions. You're not going to be able to restore polarization because the pieces are too incoherently being sent into different locations in space, so they're not going to hit the target ... in a straight line. They're going to hit ... and that's not going to be able to accelerate an electron and create electricity, which is what we see when a photon hits. All right, sending coherent particles, blah, blah, blah. However, an interference pattern emerges when these particles are allowed to build up one by one. So there's a famous video on, Veritasium did the experiment. He tried to do it over a large period of time because that's guaranteeing there's fewer photons in your experiment, and it didn't work. Couldn't get it to do this. And the only way he could get it to work is he had to keep shortening and shortening and shortening the time until it went down to 5 minutes. So he went from 4 hours to 5 minutes. And it's only by flooding, by creating more broken photons, by taking away some of the filters, allowing more pieces through, that he could get the experiment to work. Kind of demonstrating it's all bullshit. All right, this demonstrates the wave-particle duality. It doesn't do that, so I'll read this silly duality crap. Is the concept in quantum mechanics that quantum entities exhibit particle or wave properties according to the experimental circumstances. So right there, shouldn't everybody just say, oh, screw this? Somehow the most fundamental properties of the behavior of the physical entities in the universe changes based on what kind of experiment I'm doing? I mean, come on, too ridiculous. It expresses the inability of the classical concept. So this is more lies where they insult everybody who wasn't a wooicist, such as particle or wave, to fully describe behavior. Well, yes, because you're thinking about it wrong. Fundamentally wrong. You've got fundamentally wrong understanding of what a photon is, and so therefore you can't figure the truth out because you have to get that right. You have to get the foundation right, or everything you build on it will be crap. Okay. The particle is measured as a single pulse at a single position, while the modulus squared of the wave describes the probability of detecting the particle at a specific place on the screen. So again, the probability chart is so obvious. There's more probability it's in the middle and less probability going out. And they don't predict that ahead of time. They find it out by doing the experiment. So again, it's just such a pile of crap. All right. The phenomenon has been shown to occur with photons, electrons, atoms, and even molecules. So more crap about how you get the same pattern. And you don't get the same pattern, and you certainly don't get it as clear and indicating that something else is going on, that there's more involved. All right. So interferometers, I don't think I'll do that subject now. That's all. That should be a separate subject. The whole idea of beam splitters is a separate subject. Which way experiments, again, just more bullshit. Delayed choice, quantum erasure, variations. they're just using polarized film, just very complicated experiment. Doesn't really have anything to do with the simple principle. All right. And then weak measurement. So maybe, we'll just go to one of the other related subjects. So other variations might be somewhat interesting, but I doubt it. Let's see. Perform the classic Young double slit experiment with whatever that is. Metastable helium atoms pass through micrometer scale slits of gold foil. So that's probably the gold foil experiment I was talking about. Well, anyway, just all garbage. It's just about the surfaces. The surfaces explain the whole experiment. Photons can be broken, and then you can put them back together again. That's the takeaway here. All right, so some of this might be worth, I'll have to pre-read it, I guess, and see if any of this is worth going over. But, I mean, it's all, it just gets more and more bullshitty as you go through all this crap. So you can see how very different this pattern is. So photo of double slit interference of sunlight. This pattern doesn't look anything like the single slit pattern, right? There's absolutely no maximus here, and we obviously don't have a reoccurrence of the pattern. So what is this? Yeah, it's not a very good picture. I mean, it's not a very good proof of anything. All right, so path integral formulation. Again, the only formulation that works is you have to recognize in the double slit you have two distances that are creating the pattern. The closest distance between two surfaces and the farthest distance between two surfaces. Those two will decide mathematically where all four sources are in phase. Where all four sources are in phase, you get a very bright spot. Where only two sources are in phase, you get a dull spot. And when no sources are in phase, you get nothing. All right. So, many worlds interpretation. Hilarious that they put that crap in here. Yeah. Amazing. So I guess some of these stupid interpretations will be worth going over. So, I don't know why they don't have Copenhagen at the top, since that's the most popular. That's surprising. They have it here, but they don't. Oh, here it is. Yeah, there it is. All right, so yeah, maybe we'll do interpretations in the next video. But I mean, it's obvious the interpretations are all wrong. So, sorry, I had that too big. I don't know if I didn't really point to anything too important, so I think that's okay. So, sorry. Can't monitor everything. Well, I can't really monitor. I can't see over the camera, and this, I'm using a smaller monitor to save electricity, and everything's, blah 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 blah. Not making excuses, but yes, I'm making excuses. Yeah. So anyway, so till the next time, Wikipedia does absolutely suck. I mean, the fact that they will not even allow you to discuss it. They're obnoxious to discussion. They will not even discuss the fact that their page is inaccurate or nonsensical or has huge contradictions in it. They will not allow you to even discuss it. All right. Such bullshit. Crazy bullshit.